Bismillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Lockdown Library with me, Asim Qureshi. It's always very daunting to try and take on an Islamic scholar in terms of what they're about. But today I'm going to be doing that with this book, The Culture of Terrorism, Tenets and Treatments by Sheikh Dr. Abdullah bin Bayyah, who many of you will be extremely familiar with. He is an extremely well-respected scholar within the Muslim world. He has many students who are scholars in their own rights. And so it's a tough one when he writes about a subject matter that is a subject of your own research, thinking, work over many years. In fact, I had to kind of, when I first picked up the book in order to review it, I had to remind myself that actually this was my own specialist area. It's the one subject that I have focused on for the past 17 years, almost without break. And so I had to remind myself that actually I was in a position to be able to review something and perhaps push back against some of what the Sheikh might be saying. I did go into the reading with a very open mind. I was a little bit familiar, I will admit, with some of the Sheikh's views prior to picking up the book, and it's translated by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Hansen as well. There was already some familiarity with their politics prior to coming to the book. But I thought, okay, let me try my best to be fair to the Sheikh, as is right. When you're engaging with any book or subject matter, even if it's something that you feel very strongly about, I think it is important that you think very, very carefully about what other people are saying. And also, I think that it helps as well just to stop you from projecting too much on the text itself. So the Sheikh's, what he's trying to do is he's trying to understand why does terrorism take place, and then provide some guidance and some answers and responses to trying to deal with this, what is now a global phenomenon. And I do want to preface my further remarks by saying we need our Islamic scholars to be talking about this subject. We need them to be involved because they help to provide guidance to our communities, guidance which millions of people around the world listen to, and that they then take on and then carry through in their own lives. So this isn't just a case of, well, everyone needs to be a specialist in different things. Yes, of course we do, but at the same time, we need our Islamic scholars to be competent on these subject matters in a way that's useful in the long term for Muslims, not just short-term measures that help to get us out of some kind of pickle or allow for survival mode to kick in. We need to be thinking bigger and grander than just simply surviving. So, and also, like, for people like me, I think it's important that I remind myself that there is a duty, if I do have a specialist area, to try and advise those, especially amongst our scholars, where I can and how I can. So I very much went into this book with that frame of mind. The book itself is based on a lecture that the Sheikh gave in 2007 to the Organization of Islamic Countries and the OIC. And the first part really deals with the history of terrorism or political violence really with some brevity. And really the Sheikh, what he's trying to do is trying to set up the argument for the remainder of the book. What he's trying to say is that Muslims are being unfairly conflated with terrorism. There is a history of this type of activity that predates this post 9/11 period. And so he is trying to correct that view. He does want people to know that, look, this isn't something that only Muslims have been involved with. It's not a new phenomenon. And he writes, as a result, individuals, agencies, and governments in the Muslim world risked being included in this category. The determining factor, the litmus test, was one's allegiance to the West. One was either with us, meaning with the West, or against us, meaning with the terrorists. Clearly, this is not a helpful way to view the world or to address the core problems that lie at the root of terrorism. So, the Sheikh he's very, very clearly putting it out there that, there is a binary that has been created within this context of this global war on terror, one that is fairly placing all Muslims into one camp or another. It's not looking for nuance, it's not looking for complexity. And all of these kind of arguments by the Sheikh are to be praised. Like he does it, albeit briefly, in terms of covering the history of political violence. He does a good job of kind of setting the scene for us. He then relies, and it's a bit difficult for me to understand why on this study in particular, but he relies on a study by the University of Montreal, which went to the causes of terrorism. I mean, there are many studies out there. It seems a bit strange that he would rely on this one because it's not considered to be one of the most accurate studies into the causes of political violence or terrorism. But he replicates their conclusions, which is that they believe that there are 5 factors that cause terrorism. One is personal motives based that are psychological, religion, not specific to any faith, they say, political relationships, so where there's a lack of democracy and terrorism, poverty, not necessarily a direct cause, and culture, which is not given any kind of particular attention. What's really interesting about this, though, is that Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayer, he himself adds a 6th category, which he believes should be included. And this is, for me, is perhaps the most interesting one out of all of them from his perspective, because he adds injustice. That is really key to so much of how we try and understand what's going on in terms of the history, the movements, the various uses of political violence over centuries, not just decades. But then we end up in this kind of problematic area where he's trying to give examples of categories when these categories are never causative. You can't just rely on a single category for any type of violence, or indeed political violence in this case, and say this is the reason why X, Y, or Z happened. By its very nature, non-state political violence is always specific. It is always particular. When you start studying the lives and the conditions and the trajectories that not only the individual went through, but what their families went through as well, what the society of them, what the society around them organized themselves as, then you get to understand a little bit that in order to understand why a person makes the jump from being like everybody else to desiring to harm others, you have to really take into account all the different complexities, both physiological, psychological, even spiritual, actually, I would add that, into their lives. So we end up in this, strange scenario where he's, trying to present these large areas as all being causal factors, but without being able to really evidence how those take place, or how they're carried out. And despite these specific causal factors that he presents, despite his own claim that injustice is a huge part of this story, he for some reason changes track. And I think this is where I feel that there is a degree of cognitive dissonance in his argument, because what he says is that people would prefer stability over a more just society, or more. I shouldn't actually change his words. Well, he says that people want stability over, for example, utopias, right? That's really the binary that's being set up here. That stability is more important. Now, for me, this point in particular is ideological. He is tied to a notion of what the state's power and authority should look like, and because he's tied to that, he's willing to make this claim that people generally are, they want stability over, a utopian vision for their lives. Again, I think this is difficult to evidence sociologically, because what is the extent? What is the extent of oppression that people are willing to take? And at what point then do we say that we've moved into a level of injustice that requires some kind of change, that requires either leaving or changing the society itself? And that's quite important, because when we think about what we want society to look like, we also have to then take into account what degree of repression, oppression we're willing to put up with on a daily basis. And I don't think the Sheikh does a good enough job, unfortunately, of really answering that question, because it's central to this ideological point that he's put forward. So if you're going to make this claim, you have to be able to then provide some guidance and some data around how you've come to this conclusion. And yeah, I just don't think he's done that here. So, as I mentioned, despite what he says, he is ideologically tied to that framework. Which then, of course, what it does is it places blames on individuals rather than systems or structures. So now, if you take into account that it's actually the state that is most important in terms of its stability, then that means the only thing that can really change then are the individuals at an individual level. That's it. You can just change yourself to comply with what the state looks like. And that's how, in his mind, you bring about change. But again, I don't see how that works. He writes, in short, generalizing about the causes of terrorism and ignoring many salient facts prevents us from reaching a sound decision on how to handle this phenomenon. We must therefore consider that there is a culture that perpetuates such abhorrent views, and one that is characterized by their limited insight, close-mindedness, fanaticism, literalism, ignorance of the aims and objectives of jurisprudence, the fiqh al-maqasid, and an inability to assess benefit and harm. All of this results in the extremism that lies at the heart of terrorism. So again, I believe that he strays into an area that doesn't have anything to do with the causative categories that he agrees to and puts forward earlier. Where does this idea of what ideology you believe in really become tied to the reasons why political violence takes place? And I think, again, this comes back to the point that I just made, that the only thing that he can think to change is the individual, the person. And of course, as individuals, we should always be in a constant process of change, but he privileges that above any kind of systemic or societal change completely. So this is where the problem lies, that there is no vision that can be presented of changing society at a structural level, because he's tied himself to the idea that only the individuals can change. But there are some, of course, very, very useful parts of this book. And one of the actual sections I really enjoyed a great deal was one around consultative governance. I thought the Sheikh really puts forward some very interesting ideas that I would like to see put forward in a real way, in the way that we structure society. But again, like it's so interesting that in the process of talking about the Khawarij and the evils of their ideology in relation to how we put up these consultative governmental structures, you know, he quotes Umar, the second Khalif, the fifth rightly and guided Caliph of Islam, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, who says about the Khawarij, extinguish their sedition with justice. So even the Sheikh, the people that he's quoting, like there is something always that runs through where he has to recognize that the sedition itself is based around a perceived injustice that's taking place within society, but yet he doesn't seem to see the contradiction between what he's saying. So he's recognizing, when he talks about injustice, when he recognizes that that sedition comes from these this like structural injustice taking place, he can't bring himself to go to the steps to say then, well, then hold the structure to account. He then brings it back to the individual to say really where the change comes is only at the individual level. And that's why, like, for me, there will always be this cognitive dissonance in the book that, it's almost impossible to resolve, because I feel he's too ideologically attached to his position. Because you can't really have it both ways. You can't say that injustice is a cause and then not at the same time by saying that the solution is in what people believe in their ideology. Maybe the two could be worked on at the same time, but he's really kind of presenting the absence of the aspect of the structural change. So, without going too much further into the book, because I've already come to an end of this this episode, I think there are some questions to be asked about the Sheikh's own positionality with, say, for example, the United Arab Emirates, a country that's involved in the mass killing of Yemenis. It's involved with a rabid form of neoliberalism, of many forms of racism within its countries and indeed outside of its borders as well, with being involved in kind of counter-terrorism programs that are extremely harmful worldwide. And because of that, I think that in some ways clouds the entire discussion around what solutions might be, because one of the accusations that could be put is that it's difficult for him in his position, especially with the Emiratis, to be able to actually push for the notion of that type of structural change that we need, when that would require then for him to hold those the same countries to account for what they're doing in a very, very public and visceral way. So there are many things that benefit from the book. Obviously I'm coming from this particularly from my specialization, which is where the critique comes from. I did like a lot what he said about good governance. I think that's extremely important, and of course, he constantly references this idea of injustice, which I agree with. In very, very real ways, it's what underpins so much of my work. So inshallah, I hope other people will read it still, and we'll enter into discussion, debate around what the Sheikh is saying, and then hopefully from this we can kind of develop our ideas better in order to be able to give scholars better advice so that they can inform all of our communities, inshallah, about how we can bring about the changes that we want. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Islam 21C brings to you 20 brand new unique series from renowned and respected shuyukh from across the globe, with one mission: to bring Muslims together in an online congregation never seen before in history, and lift the spirit of this Ramadan to bring us closer to Allah more than ever.
Man is left with no way of knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala other than by virtue of his names and his majestic attributes that he gave himself and gifted humanity with.
We want to raise our children in the most perfect way, and perfection belongs to Allah. If a person comes to you whose religion and character pleases you, then get your daughters married to him.
It's not going to be easy, but Allah never leaves you alone. That's the essence of what we can get from the Prophet's life.
It's my pleasure, it's my honor to introduce Quran recitation from the Imam Jazari Institute.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم Now just think with me about the verse where Allah says, Inna Allah yumsiku samawati wal arda an tazula.
We'll start with an easy one for you, Sheikh, inshallah. Can I postpone Taraweeh until the last third of the night?
Yeah, so essentially the night prayer is offered after Salat al-Isha, and you have until Salat al-Fajr to offer that.
We're all linked together in this. And that's really what empathy is. I mean, empathy in Arabic is like ataf, atuf, to tilt towards, to move towards.
Conveying insults. You know, the Arabs had a saying, "Ma shatamak illa man ballagak." The one who insulted you is the one who conveyed the insult to you.
There can be no more greater relationship of a husband and a wife than the Prophet ﷺ and Khadija.
We don't just leave that piece of knowledge that we've received just there on the page.
This virus is a mercy for us Muslims, because the Prophet ﷺ, he told us in a hadith that when you are afflicted with something, it's an expiation of your sins.
Down to earth like gravity, imagine me trying to turn my dreams to reality.
Allah Jalla wa Ala mentioned those who come in the front. وَالسَّابِقُونَ السَّابِقُونَ. They are the most successful people.
How we can embed the love of the Quran in the hearts of the young generation.
Welcome to the online masjid. Sign up now for your personal access to 300 plus free on-demand video content.